The first thing Maya heard was the crack of a branch like a bone, and Coral's voice, if voice could be measured in the deep, grinding language of the forest, right behind her, a presence filling the rain with its slow, patient weight. She had been crouched with a thermometer in one hand and a camera in the other, the fog beating across her eyelashes, when something vast moved through the mist and the whole world tilted toward a memory she had not admitted to anyone, the small, stubborn body of her brother on a hospital cot, and the doctors who had told her there were no anomalies, only statistics. Maya swallowed a scream she had rehearsed for years and remembered, instead, the steadiness of data. The creature's eyes, ancient, slow as sediment, caught hers. For a single heartbeat, she understood an accusation older than any grant rejection. You came here as a marcher of lines and charts into a living place that does not ask for measurement. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Maya had trained herself to speak in minutes and pH values, in the precise edges where credence met skepticism. But words fell small in front of Coral. His body towered, shag of wet peat-brown hair threaded with lichen and bone, shoulders wide enough to reframe the path. He did not move like the caricatures in the tabloid posters the villagers kept under their counters. He moved like a tree that had just learned to walk. The villagers called him Omul Paduri, man of the forest, when they dared speak at all. They had taught Maya the steps to ask permission. Leave offerings at the stone cairn at dawn. Do not light fires on the ridge. Do not place cameras where the birches bow in winter. She had obeyed because she had no other currency here besides patience and humility. That protocol had meant nothing as Coral bent forward and brushed her hair with the tip of a finger that smelled faintly of wet earth and old stories. "Do not be afraid," she whispered, because the habit of addressing things scientifically had to converge with something human. Her mouth failed. She had rehearsed her sentence into so many police interviews and grant panels it had become a litany. Dr. Maya Voss, astrobiologist, exiled, here to study atmospheric anomalies and unusual dendrochronological signals. The truth was smaller and more human. Maya had come because satellite feeds had been humming with a rhythm like a heartbeat beneath the canopy, and because the ache in her chest had not stopped since the city took her brother with its noise and its refusal to see him. Coral's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with a long-held weariness. He sniffed the air, then tapped the moss by her boots with deliberate gentleness. Scent, in his language, was punctuation. The forest smiled in moss and splintered light. Somewhere a raven repeated a three-note phrase like punctuation from an old myth. Maya set down the camera as a kind of offering and let the rain plaster her hair to the planes of her face. Her data was still in the rolling hard drive in the pack, the satellite prints, the annotated rings she had spent nights overlaying with thermal maps. But information could wait. In the Carpathians, the first rule was survival, and survival lived on trust. He did not speak words. Instead, he pressed his palm to the trunk of an elder fir and exhaled, slow, low, so that even the lichens trembled. Maya realized Coral spoke to the trees and to whoever else listened, a grammar of pressure and scent and time. He had guarded the ridge since before the first villagers' stones had sunk in the riverbeds. His memory extended beyond a human lifetime into an era of seeds and names that humans had forgotten to say. She understood, as if in a dream, that Coral's distrust was not of her alone. It was of the tremulous line of human agencies that had, for generations, treated the world as ledger and resource. The legend of Esh found Maya like a rumor that grew teeth. The villagers spoke of a light that walked the undergrowth, of tiny columns of pulsing light that knelt like prayers beside new saplings. Children kept secret oaths to leave berries where the light had passed. Old women tightened their scarves and flashed a gaze at Maya that was a map of inherited fears. Nobody ever attached a story to the alien word, Esh, except in whispers, and then only as an exhale. A small, strange helper, a being too delicate to withstand hunters, who bent the forest like a gardener. When Maya's satellite images showed fluctuations too regular for wind and too subtle for storms, she followed the pulse, and it had led her not to a machine, but to a phenomenon that smelled of ozone and flowers. That night, after Corral melted back into the fog like a mountain receding, Maya found herself not in the tent shed camped in, but on a narrow path ringed with phosphorescent fungi. She had been careful, respectful of rights, but the world insisted it knew her not as a scientist, but as a young woman with a bloodied faith in facts. A shimmer folded air into a column no taller than a child's embrace, and from it, Esh climbed. They were not tall. They were a small, luminous thing, whose skin shifted like the inside of a pearl, and whose eyes were a map of constellations. Where Corral was rumor made manifest, Esh was memory in motion, an archivist of a different kind. They froze when they noticed Maya, and Maya realized how often she had looked at the sky and asked the wrong questions. Esh's light hummed like a tuned instrument and then bent into gestures she somehow understood: caution, curiosity, hunger for the old languages Maya called biology. Esh, Coral said, voice threading through the trees. The name was both welcome and warning. The alien bowed with emotion that found its way into the roots of the forest, their tiny hands radiating patterns of blue that made the lichens lean. Maya wanted to ask about ships and other worlds, about why an alien would learn the slow grammar of moss and the tender architecture of a root network. But the questions that mattered here were more terrifying and more immediate. What could this small being do for the trees, and what could it do for the people who thought to take them? Esh hovered closer, scentless like light, and touched a sapling with a finger that left a lattice of golden tracery. The sapling shivered, leaves uncurling as if the tiny alien had read it aloud. Maya's throat constricted. She thought of the city's pollutants and the dry cough that had come for her brother, of the machines that counted numbers but never listened. The alien's touch was not magic so much as a technology of care, an engineering of growth that did not grind or strip but coaxed and sang. "You should not be here," Coral said to Maya, the sentence a rock placed between them. His warning held no threat of immediate violence, only the weight of a guardian who had watched once gentle hands become tools of ruin. "This ridge remembers what you forget." Maya answered with the honesty that had cost her every respectable institution. "I need to know if what I'm seeing is real, if there are mechanisms, if Esh's work could be understood, scaled, shared. It might be the proof to stop more like my brother." Her voice broke on the last word, and she tasted metal. She had rehearsed professional variations, ecosystem services, biomimicry, but the little tremor in the language made her say what science often drowned. She wanted to redeem the past. Coral's eyes unfurled sorrow like a banner. He had seen the appetite expand over time, felt the bloodless knife of chainsaws in the stomach of the valley. His species had retreated, and now his heart, if it could be called that, beat in the rhythm of standing guards and secret groves. He was a shepherd of species, a cataloger of loss. He smelled Maya's grief and remembered his own, the slow thinning of his kin, the young taken by snares and by the hunger for land that never stopped. He moved his hand in a circle, a dismissal and an offer in one. "We choose who knows," he said, not with words but with the press of his hand to the earth. "Knowledge is a thing like a river. It nurtures and it floods." Esh flickered like a star and then steadied. They stepped toward Maya and spoke, not with voice but with light, patterns that the forest seemed to understand, and that Maya, to her alarm, felt in the molar memory of her bones. Esh offered her a bargain with the soft brutality of someone who had watched planets die and had to ration hope. "We will show you," their light said. "You will promise to hold this language as we do, not as a broadcast, but a lock. You must teach restraint." The bargain stung with the price of everything Maya wanted. To be believed again, to have her name restored in journals and halls that had dismissed her as a conjurer of impossible ideas. Yet to promise silence when the world could be saved by transparency felt like complicity in a slow erasure. She thought of her brother's eyes in the hospital light, asked the question her field could not answer. Would proof have saved him? Would it have mattered if the world could be made to see? Around them, the ridge listened. An old woman from the nearest hamlet, who had followed without the posture of a scientist, but with the bulldog persistence of someone born into the weather of this place, watched from a rock. Her hands were knotted like roots. She knew Esh as a word to bless a child, and Coral as a terror and a saint. She called out across the damp and said, "No cameras," in a voice that could divide rain. The villagers had a different calculus: preserve or speak, hidden or revealed, and each decision had a face. Maya's instruments, humming faintly in her pack, suddenly felt like weapons or lifelines. She had come to quantify anomalies and to stitch them into evidence. Here, the anomalies were alive, tendril-like technologies of regeneration, and a giant who remembered when the river's banks were full of fish. The tension between her training and the forest's resistances felt physical, a tug at the ribcage. Coral's warning pulsed. Knowledge can be salvation, and it can be extractive. Esh's bargain glowed with the loneliness of someone who had been both healer and witness. Maya, who had already been exiled once for bringing forward too late truths, had to decide whether to be a witness or an exposer. The rain swelled as if the sky had been waiting to eavesdrop. Maya unzipped her pack with fingers that trembled and held up the small recorder that had become her confession box. "I'll learn," she said finally, her voice a thin, pledging rope. "I'll learn the ways you teach. But you must know, I cannot promise silence forever. People are hungry, and governments are not gentle. If what you show me could save forests everywhere." Coral's palm on the earth stilled that sentence. He had no words for law, no category for policy. He had the slow arithmetic of seasons and the knowledge of how quickly human hunger sounded like a flood. He tilted his head, and in the gesture, Maya felt centuries of judgment and a small, merciless love. He would test her the way old trees test a new shoot: weight, wind, and survival. Isha's light braided a pattern across Maya's skin, warm, intimate, asking not for consent but for something like trust. "We will teach you the language of growth," the light said. "You will be careful. You will become a guardian of this secret, or you will break what you are trying to save." Maya's throat tightened. Her life had been a ledger of precautionary ethics, experimental marginalia scrawled by a woman who had been told her questions were fantasies. Now the universe offered her a living experiment, and the stakes that hung with it were sharper than any peer review. To walk with these two, one made of ancient roots, one of interstellar memory, meant she would have to choose a kind of authority she had never been taught: humility, braided with fierce vigil. The rain, patient as a church, tapped the leaf above them and wrote a wet transcript. The ridge watched, And for the first time in a long while, Maya felt the strange, terrifying possibility that being believed by the things that mattered might be worth the world's impatience. The bargain hung between them like a wet cloak, heavy and intimate. Maya felt the barter in the hollow of her ribs, knowledge for secrecy, exposure for protection. Isha's light pulsed against her skin in a pattern that suggested breath. Coral's posture was a slow tightening around something tender in the valley. The old woman on the rock watched with the patience of someone who had outlived much and had learned to read the smallness of promises. When she finally spoke, it was not to Maya, but to the ridge itself, as if naming the place would call it awake. We have kept her safe because we always knew some hands would come that only knew to take. Maya's mind spun through the legal implications, intellectual property, conservation law, the mouths she would have to feed with proof. She saw grant panels dissolving into headlines. She pictured her name pre-dawn on posters, mad scientist or savior. The thought burned like a fever. The city had flattened nuance into binary before. Now the primal fear of exploitation raised its head. If Esch's ministrations could reverse erosion and coax a denuded slope back into forest in a season, corporations and governments would not ask for permission. They would arrive with permits and machines. She swallowed and tried to imagine a way to translate Esch's luminous touch into a protocol that could be taught gently, an apprenticeship of restraint rather than a manual for extraction. "Teach me slowly," she said finally. Her voice contained the surrender of someone who had been disciplined by failure. "Teach me the smallest things first. Let me watch nights and learn the language without instruments. Let me put my hands where your hands want them." She wanted to be the patient student who would not break a twig out of anxiety for results. Esch brightened as if relieved. The small being unfolded a map of their practice in a cascade of lights, slow and deliberate. Maya felt the image like a pulse under her skin. Root networks tuned to a frequency no sonar had ever read. Mycorrhizal exchanges that counted like a gossip of fungi. Sap ascending with a new pace that felt like healed lungs. Esch taught Maya to read the sound of sap, to feel via a roughened thumb the difference between a root content and a root mourning. Under their tutelage, what had been sterile data transformed into a world that answered when touched. Coral watched these exchanges with a caution that was part ache. He moved around Maya as one might a sleeping child and the child's fevered blanket, testing but not intervening. When Maya knelt to press her ear to a root, her breath fogging in the cool, a tremor of memory passed through Coral, as if he remembered the first time another species had knelt in the dirt and promised to care. He had been betrayed before. His kin had vanished into traps baited with promises of jobs and development. He had learned to read hands like some read weather. Maya's hands trembled with a nervousness born of too many misread signals in her life. Esch's light steadied her. At dawn, Esch taught Maya how to listen to the ridge's history. They hummed a frequency that made lichens open like sleeping mouths. They coaxed spores to rise and embroidered a pattern of new growth across a dead patch. Maya's scientific mind cataloged what she could: wavelengths, enzymatic upticks, ionic shifts in sap. But the cataloging sat beside a new experience, an intimacy with time that no paper could contain. She felt seasons in the curve of a cambium ring, and grief in the way some roots had given up their climb. The data she could export now felt like diaries stolen from living beings. Every chart was the biography of a throat that had once held a song. Trust grew, but it did so like a vine, tentative, catching on bark, and sometimes slipping. Maya would arrive with her recorder and scribble furiously, then stop at Coral's look. She would set up a camera, and then, when she noticed the way the animals shifted, disconnect it and hide the hardware among moss. Esh taught her the ethics of absence. Sometimes healing meant not witnessing. Sometimes protection meant becoming a phantom. These rules tugged at something Myers had once taught her in a lecture, the observer effect. But in the forest, it felt moral rather than merely methodological. There were ruptures. On the third week, her compass went haywire, and a satellite pinged dangerously close. Maya scolded herself for it. An accidental signal, the result of her recorder's automatic upload, a historic habit of sending data home each night. She had started to set her pack to airplane mode. Then, one night she had forgotten, and a server in the city received a packet stamped with the ridge's coordinates. That small bureaucratic error sent ripples. Corral's wrath was quiet but awful as a low thunder. He paced the ridge and bared teeth at the sky. The villagers noticed the change. Dogs that usually slept at thresholds began to howl. The old woman who had watched from the rock spat into her palm and said, "We told her." There was no anger at Maya in her voice, only the iron blame of those who have watched mistakes translate into losses. Maya felt as though she had sprung a leak in the ribcage of the valley. Esh's light dimmed for days, a physical depression of luminescence that made the undergrowth look as if some film had been pulled across the forest. "You broke a rule," Esh's patterns said to Maya. Their tones were not punitive so much as mournful. "You have made the ridge known to circuits that do not love it." Maya's shame was a tangible thing. She had imagined herself to be a careful archivist. Instead, she had been reckless. She thought of her brother, how one unnoticed pulse had been missed by a hospital machine and then dismissed. And the connection turned acid. If she had been able to control that single instrument, would the city have been kinder? Had the same mechanical negligence been given a human face the day she sent the coordinates? When a government drone first came over the ridge 2 nights later, it was a small machine, polished and efficient, but it had the weight of empire in its lens. Maya saw it glint above the pines and felt heat bloom in her cheeks. Corral reacted by shaking his massive shoulders and letting loose a sound that made birds scatter like broken coins. The drone dipped lower, probably recording disturbance and, where it could, signatures. Maya wanted to run after it, to smash it with prehistoric fury, but Corral stopped her with a look. His restraint was the same that had kept him from tearing down a logging crew once and instead annihilating their machines. He knew that violence rippled outward. He had a strategy that was slow as root growth, misdirection, obfuscation, and the secrecy of the old ways. Esh, meanwhile, withdrew into a niche in an elder beech and worked themselves through patterns of light that seemed like prayer. They initiated Maya into new, more subtle practices, ways to fold electromagnetic noise into the forest's chatter, ways to make the ridge hum in a frequency drones would ignore. They showed her to bury devices in a web of moss and fungi that absorbed emissions. Maya learned to make her presence as light as a footstep. Yet every night she checked her recorder with hands that could not stop shaking, and every night she compounded betrayals with the gratitude that their lessons elicited. The villagers' relationship to Maya shifted. Some felt protective, having watched her risk and repent. Others muttered that she was trouble, an agent of the city who had come with ears to eavesdrop on the forest. The old woman, Marta, whose family had been in the valley for generations, took Maya aside one wet evening and said in a voice like scraped wood, "You must decide whose hands you belong to." It was not a moral test so much as a practical one. The valley had always been a web of loyalties. To belong to 2 masters was to be torn. Maya tried to thread loyalty to both. She sent coded notes to a trusted colleague at a remote conservation NGO, someone who had earlier defended her at a disciplinary board and who had the capacity to lobby quietly. She asked for discretion, and for discretion was a currency rarer than money. The reply she received was a thin encouragement. "We will look into this cautiously." and it felt like a lifeline tied with twine. But news traveled faster through bureaucracy than it did through care. A mid-level bureaucrat forwarded a curiosity to a higher office. A glance became interest. Interest became a file. Maya felt the net tightening, and it terrified her. Emotional weather shifted in smaller motions, too. Coral taught her how to read shame in moss by directing a muzzle under a fallen log like a mournful animal and pointing to the tuft with wooden syntax. Maya learned to apologize without words by placing a flat stone near the cairn, by leaving a small knit hat where a child might later find it. Esh taught Maya how to celebrate. They would coax a sapling to bloom out of season and then orchestrate a little chorus of light among the fungi so the hill shivered with joy. Maya learned to accept joy like a borrowed warmth. Their triangle of trust remained fragile. Each held a piece of the valley's future, and each piece required sacrifice. Coral's sacrifice was vigilance, a loneliness that looked like a wall. Esh's was the loneliness of the witness, the one who watches dying worlds and refuses to make the same mistakes. They hoarded knowledge because knowledge had once been a weapon. Maya's sacrifice was the hardest. The potential to give up the recognition that had been everything to her and instead be the hidden keeper, a ghost in the ledger. Pressure mounted when word of the anomalous thermal signatures leaked beyond the valley's careful net. It started as a rumor at a town market, a hushed exchange about lights in the trees and men who smelled of oil. One of the villagers, desperate for work after the mills closed, saw an opportunity and walked into the town hall with a story. The mill's representatives listened, as they always did, with mouths open to possibility. The idea of a place that could regrow hills in a season was manna. Prospects of redevelopment and reconnection with a world that had been economically cruel began to chatter at the edges of decisions. Maya watched the human hunger blossom like mold. She felt like a doctor who had opened a wound and now had to hide the remedy from those whose hands would make it rot. Coral's reaction was slow fury. He learned that the only way to protect was to sharpen the rules. One night, while the rain made small rivers along the footpaths, Corral took Maya and Esh up to an ancient ring of stones. It was a place that had once been a map made by his kin, markers of water sources and safe hollows. He pressed his palm into the center stone, and then, with a softness that was almost too human, said, through scent and pressure and a gesture toward the sky, "This is the world's covenant. We give knowledge only when you can protect it with more than words." Esh replied with a flare of lights that spelled a sequence of reassurance. They had, in their years among the trees, worked out protocols for secrecy. Emergency dispersal, contagion of light that would confuse instruments, and the slow work of teaching the forest to forget coordinates. Maya listened, heart hammering, and realized the coming choices would not be between exposure and secrecy in the abstract. They would be about people, about her brother's face in memory, about the villagers' children who might be hungry, and also about the forest's right to not be industrialized. Each choice would leave someone in loss. When she finally spoke, it was a sentence laced both with humility and assertion. "Then teach me everything I can absorb," she said, "and let me be the one who says no when I have to. If I must break a promise to stop a greater betray, let it be a last resort. But I will not let this be used for greed." Corral regarded her, and in the long dent of his gaze there was a calculation like the laying down of roots. He accepted her pledge not because it was perfect, but because it was the only thing that felt like human courage. The old woman, Marta, sealing the accord with a curving exhale, placed her palm atop Maya's, the gesture of grafting old wood to a new sapling. The forest listened and seemed to nod. Night tightened around that accord like a hand closing, and within it, for the first time since Maya's arrival, there was a fragile weave of hope. They would teach. Maya would learn to be careful. The villagers would hold back their greed. But there remained a tension, a coiled risk. The world beyond the trees was full of men who counted forests as balance sheets. The next test would not be a drone or a rumor. It would be the arrival of a proper extraction team, sanctioned and mechanized, drawn by a rumor made sharp by hunger. Maya felt the moment approaching like the after-scent of rain, inevitable and wet with consequence. They slept poorly that night, each one of them listening for a sound that could mean rescue or ruin. The forest kept its breath in its bark. Maya, tucked under a canopy of borrowed patience, dreamed of her brother's laugh and of Isha's lights and of Coral's slow, immovable strength. When she woke at pre-dawn, the ridge was already awake with movement. Animals, wind, and the distant mechanical whisper that whispered of men who would come with permits and with promises they could not keep. The act of choosing had begun, and none of them would be the same afterward. The whisper grew into a roar in the bones of the valley. Trucks, engines like distant storms, arriving with a confidence that had smelled like inevitability since Maya's first missent data packet. The team came not as thieves in the night, but as a parade with letters and seals and a legal calm that frightened Marta more than gunshots ever could. They were city men in clean boots, men who wore policy like armor and smiled with the slow precision of those accustomed to getting what they wanted. They brought cameras off tripods and banners of corporate green, the sort of green that had never learned to kneel. Coral smelled them before they crossed the ridge. His anger was not a thing of teeth, but of weather. He moved through the trees with a force that made sap run faster and made small creatures hide in their burrows. When word reached the plateau, someone had seen the trucks coil at the foot of the long road. Someone had flagged down a ranger. It unstitched a fragile order. The villagers who had once invited curiosity now clenched their jaws. The old woman, Marta, walked to the cairn and began to chant names the trees had once taught her, names that were not words so much as petitions. Maya wanted to tell the men to go home, to show them the liturgy of the ridge and the living law in the cambium rings, but she had learned the hard arithmetic of words. You could argue with the conscience of a person, but paper and grants moved in a different gravity. When the men arrived, they did so with polite declarations. A polite man in a blue jacket, whose name badge proclaimed a ministry, extended a hand and offered a speech about sustainable development and community benefits. He said the right things. Yes, restore the economy. Yes, partner with locals. And Maya saw the scope of seduction in every syllable. She watched Coral from the edge of the tree line, his silhouette a question mark against the fog. She watched Esh shrink into their niche and light a little so that only creatures close could see. The men circled the cairn, notebooks out, and one of them, young, with a tremor of hunger in his eyes, brought out a tablet that began to map the slope with clinical flourish. Marta met them with the bluntness of those who know the cost of promises. "This land is not for sale," she said, and the men smiled with mechanisms meant to soothe. They asked to survey, they asked to test, they asked for access. Maya's recorder sat heavy in her pack like a confession. She could feel Esh's light waving at her like a thin hand. Do not. Coral's presence was a tide of scent and height that made the men feel small in a way they did not like. Yet one by one, the men found reasons to return with permits, and someone in the municipal office pulled an old map that had a clean line where the ridge met the ledger, and a legality began to thread itself through the forest like a new route. Betrayal, Maya learned, had many faces. The first fracture came not from a chainsaw, but from the very people she had hoped to be allied with. An NGO liaison who had once sat in a tribunal defending her asked in hushed tones if there might be funding to make the project scalable. He used the word with a kindliness that made it a knife. He explained, in the language of global conservation that Maya had once worshipped, that secrecy would limit their ability to get government protections. If the grove could be documented, given coordinates, it could be argued for in courts. It could be designated a protected area. His logic glittered. Maya's heart wanted to clutch at it like a drowning person at a rope. Corral smelled the lie in the careful words. He moved through the crowd, large and solemn, and pressed his palms against the trunks as if to steady the earth. He offered nothing verbal. His test was this: he would not allow instruments near the heart of the grove. He would permit sampling at the perimeter only. The men in suits nodded as if this were a concession. They left with promises that smelled like rain but tasted stale. Maya watched them go with a stomach that had become a hollowed-out drum. Esh's patience frayed. They had taught Maya how to fold signals into lichens, how to hide signatures in the forest's own noise. They had taught her to be small, to become the shadow of a person who loved loud. Yet now, when an entire bureaucracy leaned on the valley like a heavy hand, their small technologies felt like pebbles against a dam. Esh brightened at the thought of alliances. They wanted to believe that Maya could be the bridge between species and systems. But their history, watching worlds fire for greed and science turned into weapons, made them cautious to the point of despair. The first schism came at dusk, in a tent where Maya and the NGO liaison debated ethics like two people speaking different dialects of the same desperate language. He argued that protocols could be built to protect the grove. He named committees and legal avenues and the press release that would change the valley's fortunes. Maya argued back with the vocabulary of someone who had watched a brother's last breaths labeled comorbidity and buried under a pile of plausible deniability. They will come with permits, she said, and they will come with lawyers who read trees as resources. They will legalize the violence. The liaison, whose name was Tomas, softened, and then, in the way of those who need to keep believing in systems, he said, "Then we make a system that cares. If you won't let us document it, at least let us gain protection under law. Silence is not protection when bureaucracy can be weaponized against a place that has no voice." His words struck a nerve. Maya thought of Corral's warning about knowledge that floods. If the grove could be legally defined, what would stop corporations from buying the very protections they meant to use? The logic of law was slippery. It could be built like a fortress or like a cage. The debate turned from theory to rage. Tomas called for a compromise. A single, supervised survey team, no uncontrolled broadcasts, and a promise of strict confidentiality. He put his name on the line in ink. Maya wanted to believe him. Her mind fractured between the possibility of legal safeguards and the memory of human appetite. Corral's reaction to the proposed survey was a slow, painful withdrawal. He took Maya by the shoulder with a hand that could have crushed bone, but instead carried an old tenderness. He guided her to the ring of stones and, with a motion that was almost prayerful, separated a twig and let it fall into the hollow. He sent up a scent that carried the news into the roots. He did not say, in words, that he distrusted the human system. He showed it by stepping away, by making himself a presence that required recompense beyond a signature. Esh was furious in a manner their species rarely showed. They dimmed their entire body into an ashen pallor and refused to shine. They had believed Maya to be a student who would bear secrecy like a sacrament. The proposed survey felt like a breach. "You asked for a lock," their light said to Maya in cold patterns. "You have invited a keymaker." Maya's own fracture opened as guilt and fear braided into a single thick cord. She wanted to protect the grove and to honor the villagers' hunger. She wanted to save the forest and to rescue her reputation. She had thought, naively, she admitted, that she could be both a scientist and a guard. The survey plan splintered that belief. The villagers themselves split. Martha and a handful of elders argued for concealment. Others whispered that money from responsible partners could feed their children. The conversation at the tavern grew ugly. The valley's trust, which had once wrapped Maya like a cloak, now frayed at the edges. The decisive fracture arrived like a blunt instrument, a photograph. A young man from the town, eager and terrified, took a picture of Esh shimmering at the base of a sapling and sent it, with a caption that promised riches, to a friend in the city. The image found its way to a private developer who knew how to make interest bloom into action. Within 48 hours, the trucks multiplied. Within 72 hours, a legal warrant sat against the valley that smelled like judgment. Corel exploded in fury. He charged for the road with an ancient, devastating power, felled a steel gate with a single press of his shoulder, and sent men staggering like saplings. There was fear, and there was violence, but there was also clarity. Corel's action made enemies and martyrs all at once. The men who had come with polite words now came back with helmets and ropes. A camera, which had been discarded in panic, blinked and sent a scream of coordinates into a network. Maya saw the cascade of consequences as if through a window that broke at every pane. Esh, whose small hands had once coaxed life, now detonated a defense that was both beautiful and terrible. They unfurled a braid of light that blanketed the ridge and rewired local electromagnetic frequencies. Machinery sang like a throat with a stone. Electronics failed, compasses spun like dizzy insects, and for a moment the men in suits were reduced to stumbling shadows. The defense bought them time, but it also announced to the world that this place had technologies far beyond myth. It was an act of protection that telegraphed possibility. The fractures were not only external. The bond between Maya and Corel cracked under the strain. He had allowed her into the inner ring, had trusted her hands and promises, and yet a human sent a picture that led to the ruin. Maya's apology, raw and repeated, was not balm. Corel's grief morphed into a coldness that cut through the soft places between them. He no longer let her touch the oldest trees. Instead, he circled her like a sentinel circles a wound. Esh's disappointment was a different blade. They had allowed themselves to hope that Maya might belong to the forest first, to become a guardian who would weigh laws with the scale of seasons. Instead, she had brought people whose hunger could not be governed by promises. Esh withdrew their secrets, the patterns of light that healed, tucked them into a place their species kept for when trust was earned, not given. Maya watched as the small being she had come to adore folded into a silence that felt like exile. The villagers split into camps. Some blamed Maya as the bringer of ruin. Others blamed the gossiping youth who had taken the photograph. Old arguments about land, about modernity, about trust, opened like old wounds. Marta sat with her hands in her lap and wept, not for the men who had come, but for the fragile covenant between people and place that had been sundered. The ridge, which had been a living cooperation between species, now wore the marks of human impatience. Maya felt each accusation like a stone. She had come to mend, and instead had torn. In the days that followed, acts of vengeance and grace braided together. Corel sabotaged a supply truck with a precision that betrayed a long memory of human cruelty. It was a small act that aimed to prevent an avalanche. Esh responded by sharing a minor repair signal with the villagers, teaching them how to cloak their radios and make their signals disappear like ghosts. Maya walked between both, attempting to undo harm with gestures that felt too small. She planted seedlings by hand. She carried water in her palms to saplings weakened by noise. She apologized to Esh with a bowl of river stones arranged in a rhythm that meant, "I am yours now." She tried to explain to Corral the anarchy of systems and the difficulty of a single person holding both worlds. But the fissures had widened into chasms. The final break came quietly, as many things that cannot be reconciled do. One night, under a sky rinsed of stars, Esh packed a small bundle of their devices, luminous filaments that acted as both keys and memories, and offered them to Maya with a look that held a choice. Take them and become the keeper, or refuse and let their species retreat into the archive. Maya wanted to promise everything. Her hands shook. Corral watched from the ring of stones with an expression Maya could not read. It was neither approval nor anger, but the blankness of someone who had learned to protect by letting go. Maya took the filaments. She swore, with a voice that made Esh's light wobble, to keep their language secret, to use it only as necessary. But the valley had been changed. The trust was marred, relationships splintered. Corral retreated into the deeper woods, his patient guardianship replaced with an isolation that was like exile. Esh, while not gone, withdrew their full self behind patterns and agreements that would take years to rebuild. And Maya, torn between the hunger for proof and the ache to keep living things alive, found herself a keeper of a secret that felt more like a wound than a treasure. That night she slept badly, the filaments coiled like sleeping things in her pack. Outside, the ridge breathed with the slow labor of a place that had weathered men and machines before. She understood on a bone level that the fractures were not solely the result of one photograph or one mistake. They were the inevitable consequence of three species learning, badly and then better, how to entwine. Each fracture would be a lesson, she told herself, a ledger entry whose currency was pain. The morning would bring more decisions, more strategies. For now, the valley held its breath and mourned what had been lost to haste. Beneath the canopy, things whispered about repair. But a fissure is a thing that remembers the hand that cracked it, and repair, like growth, is patient in ways that may anger those who prefer the fast justice of headlines. Maya lay awake and promised, quietly, not to become a headline. It was the smallest vow she could offer, and perhaps the only one that could stitch together over years what had been torn. Corral moved like a rumor made solid. He returned to the ring of stones at dusk the night the trucks were stalled by uprooted hedgerows and sudden gullies. His quiet sabotage had bought hours, but he did not come to rage. He came to do what he had always done, hold the wound of the valley open until someone inside it could learn to stitch. Maya found him there beneath a sky the color of old metal. He smelled of rain and a sorrow made older by the hours. Esh hovered nearby, a pale lantern whose light trembled as if the small being carried its own fear like a shawl. "You have broken with them," Corral said, not with words, but with a pressure on the earth that Maya felt in the soles of her feet. "You let humans draw a map." Maya's answer was the raw honesty she had cultivated by failures. "I did. I thought I could guide them. I thought I could make law care. I was wrong." She had rehearsed confessions in hospital corridors and grant offices. Here, the admission sounded like rain on tin, simple, necessary, and not for show. Corral did not soften immediately. His trust was a slow currency. It was bought with seasons, with quiet tasks, with the proof of survival. He rose and took Maya's hand with a tenderness that surprised her. The enormous palm dwarfed her wrist, but the pressure was careful, as if measuring pulse. Then, "Be careful with it," Esh's light translated. And in that brevity, there was both a warning and a benediction. The extraction crew returned at dawn with legal papers and teeth. They expected the tired surrender of a small place. Instead, the valley offered a counter-strategy that might have seemed improbable to men who counted everything by profit margins. Maya stood before them with Corral at her right and Esh at her left. The three of them made an odd tribunal: ancient guardian, exile scientist, and a being that had watched stars die. Maya felt the old humiliation uplift into a different kind of authority. She had nothing to offer these men but truth, and sometimes truth was the only weapon left. "We can make a plan," the ministry man began, his voice polished into patience. "We can do sustainable harvesting, community benefits." "No," Maya said, her voice sharper than she expected. It was the first time she had spoken publicly, not as a scientist begging to be heard, but as a steward who had been entrusted. "You cannot analogize a living thing into a resource. You are asking to legalize theft." Corral pressed himself between the road and the grove. He did not threaten with teeth. He threatened with the slow certainty of the forest reclaiming what was taken. Trucks stalled again as their electronics, which had been coaxed by Esh's subtle interference, blinked out. Men argued, cameras whirred to life, and for every piece of paper the ministry men waved, the ridge sang back a counter-argument in wind and broken pulse. Esh did something Maya had not seen them do before. They stepped into light and made themselves visible to the human eyes aimed at them. Their small, trembling form turned the men into children who had been caught before they knew the law. Ash's luminescence braided into patterns that showed not weapons, but the archive of healing they'd coaxed into the roots. Images that ran through Maya's mind like film. Denuded slopes knitting green in weeks, saplings that remembered how to drink rain, a mycelial chorus that traded warning for growth. The footage made the men quiet because they felt, in a way their contracts could not account for, the moral gravity of what they were about to undo. Seeing Esh made the world ask a difficult question. Could a government shut down a being that was not just an organism, but a caretaker? The legal men shifted in their suits. Some found language for wonder. Others calculated patents. Thomas, the liaison who had once offered legal paths, lowered his head and said, "We were wrong to presume we owned the answer." He had been changed by what he had seen. The line on his face had become less smooth. It was not repentance that saved them, but the beginning of a human mercy. The moment of choice arrived when a contractor lunged for a sapling with gloved hands, a symbolic act of taking that would have been televised into proof of treatable resourcehood. Coral moved like a slow avalanche and intercepted the hand. He did not hurt the man. Instead, he carried him gently to the cairn and set him down like a child who had lost their way. Maya stepped forward beside Coral and placed her palm over the contractor's upturned face. Her touch was not scientific. It was an anchor. "Look," she said, voice small but carrying. She called to the miners of law and policy and said, "You will not take this, because a living thing has rights that paper cannot invent." Esh circled the group and let a tiny filament brush the contractor's sleeve. The man shuddered, as if remembering something he had never known. The smell of seedlings after rain, his mother's fingers planting a garden, the slow, shameful knowledge of an industry that had fed him with the exploitation of others. Tears broke suddenly on the man's cheeks. Legal armor is thin against a memory you did not believe you owned. It was not a clean victory. Men left muttering curses. Some plotted returns. The ministry clerk promised reviews and red tape, and the slow machinery of bureaucratic protection. The community gained an agreement that required independent stewards. In return, several elders were invited to sit on an oversight board that would be empowered to decline development for conservation reasons. It was messy, imperfect, and it required constant vigilance. Maya knew laws could be bent. She also knew then that she had the leverage of witnesses who had seen not only data, but a living being choose to be vulnerable and therefore revealed the moral absurdity of extraction. The real sacrifice came later that night when Maya and Coral sat under the ring of stones. Coral had watched her with a new kind of stillness. He had seen her stand in the face of men and knew that the city could punish or pardon. He placed his forehead against hers in a gesture that made Maya sob with relief and fear. "You will be watched," he said, his scent folding into hers like a binding. "I know," Maya answered. "I will be watched, and I will keep watch." She placed the luminous filaments Esh had entrusted to her into Coral's palm, the alien lights bathing their skin in ghostly gold. "I will take this knowledge and hide it in the shapes of moss and teaching, and I will not let my need for proof become the road for someone's greed." Coral's great hand closed around the filaments with a gentleness that made Maya feel both small and chosen. He could have demanded they be buried, or burnt, or given to the earth. Instead, he accepted them as a pact. A human would carry a secret they were not entitled to, and in exchange, he would teach her how to be invisible when the world demanded revelations. Ash nodded, and then, in a movement that felt like returning a favor, leaned forward and pressed their light to Maya's heart. The sensation was not alien at all, but an echo of belonging, an imprint that would, in time, let her sense when the ridge ached and when it healed. "You become one with the ledger of living things," Esh murmured in patterns that Maya felt like warmth. "You will have to be stronger in your patience than in your proofs." Maya thought then of her brother's hospital bed and the noise that had drowned him. She thought of the hunger that had sent men to town with pictures, and of the old woman Marta's knotted hands. She understood, fully now, that redemption would not be a single headline. It would be years of small, faithful tending, teaching a village to steward resources without selling them, testifying in courts when necessary, refusing cameras when they meant harm, and sometimes, in the deepest secrecy, coaxing a sapling back to breath with an alien touch learned by heart. Coral rose and gestured at the ridge, a sweep that included moss and stone, Esh and Maya, dogs and the thin road. "We walk together," he said, by scent and pressure. "You will learn our language of keeping." Maya put her head against Coral's shoulder and let the enormity of him hold her. "I will," she whispered. "I will carry it like a promise." They made a small covenant there, human vow braided with ancient duty and alien witness. It was imperfect and fragile, but in the hush that followed, the ridge itself seemed to breathe easier. For the first time since the photograph, the fissures settled like silt. The travelers left with grudging respect. Some would return with bureaucratic teeth, others with quiet support. Maya knew battles remained, but she held in her hand the sacrament of Esh's filaments and the warmth of Coral's slow, immovable trust. That night, as rain began again and Esh painted slow constellations across the undergrowth, Maya made another sacrifice. She took her records, the charts, the early thermal maps, the nights of recordings, and sealed them in a hollow the forest would keep, an archive encoded with Esh's light patterns and wrapped in moss that Coral had salted with memory. She could have used them to regain her name. She chose instead to bury the proof in a place where it could be called upon by stewards, not profiteers. She slept with her hand tucked into Coral's fur and Esh's light warming her chest. And in that close, unlikely triangle, something like belonging took root. The redemptive work would be long. Petitions, patrols, quiet teaching, and the slow rebuilding of trust. But in the sacrament of that night, where a human gave up public glory for private keeping, where an ancient guardian softened enough to allow touch, and where an alien made itself known to save rather than to be weaponized, the valley learned a new grammar for survival. It was not a neat romance of rescue, but a messy, crucible-forged alliance that traded fame for fidelity. When dawn came, the ridge hummed with small life. Maya rose and, for the first time since arriving, felt the width of her choices like a shield. She had no guarantees. She had only a pact and a willingness to keep walking. She would stand in the line between civilization and wildness, a human whose hands would now always be stained with both dirt and stars. Maya sat on a stone, fingers threading through moss, watching Corral and Esh move like two slow prayers. The village had found a brittle truce, a paper line that promised oversight and guarded access, and the ministry had agreed to a council where elders and stewards could veto development. It was ugly and fragile, but it kept trucks at bay. Maya became their emissary, not with reports to win fame, but with quiet attestations, traveling to hearings to ask for patience instead of profit. She taught lawyers about mycorrhizae and coaxed courts to see networks as citizens of a living polity. Corral returned to the deeper ridge and kept nightly watch, his patience now paired with a measured allowance. He came to council only rarely, and when he did, he moved like an old law, bending conversations toward the long view. Esh taught a handful of villagers to read the ridge's frequencies, to cloak radios, to seed fungal filters that ate telemetry. In exchange, villagers shared food, stories, and watch. They learned to speak the language of restraint. Maya kept the filaments wrapped in moss, and when researchers asked for proof, she brought them instead to community forums, showing them the faces of those who would steward the land. She refused headlines, chose slow testimony over fast fame, and in that refusal discovered a steadier authority. Children learned to plant with Isha's light, and old women taught the next generation how to barter with silence. Marta and the council became the public face, while Maya recorded in secret, a ledger stored beneath an elder root and encoded in patterns only Ish could sing. Seasons passed. Storms came and mended scars. New saplings rose where trucks once aimed. The valley learned to be wary and generous at once. Maya fell into a life of small, unglamorous rituals, checking filaments at dusk, teaching a clerk how to listen to growth, delivering bread to watchers. Her name was not on every journal anymore, but when she walked through town, people nodded, thankful in ways larger than accolades. Corral once stood on a high bluff and let the rain run through him. He turned and found Maya below, small and weathered, and lifted a garland of wet moss to her head. Ish braided constellations into the canopy, and in that slow weaving, the three of them learned a finer grammar of belonging. At dusk, Maya whispered to the ridge, "We will keep what remembers," and the forest answered, in the soft language of sap, by unfurling a new green into the breathing dark.